Around the year 1177 BC, the world ended. Not the whole world, not all at once in a single night, but across the eastern Mediterranean a web of kingdoms and empires that had traded, warred, and written to one another for centuries. The lights went out. City after city was burned to the ground. Great palaces that had stood for generations were abandoned to the sand. Entire writing systems were forgotten, and a way of life that millions of people had believed was permanent simply stopped. We call it the Late Bronze Age collapse. And more than 3,000 years later, we still do not fully understand why it happened. But we know this: it was not the last time. It was the first great descent, the earliest recorded instance of an entire interconnected civilization coming apart. And when you understand how the Bronze Age world died, you begin to see a pattern, a shape that history returns to again and again. This is where that pattern begins. To understand the fall, you have to understand what was lost. Picture the eastern Mediterranean around 1200 BC. This was not a scattering of primitive villages. This was a connected world, arguably the first truly globalized civilization in human history. In Egypt, the pharaohs of the New Kingdom ruled a state that was already ancient, its monuments older to them than the Romans are to us. To the north, in what is now Turkey, the Hittite Empire commanded a vast territory, rivaling Egypt as a superpower. Along the coast of the Levant, wealthy port cities like Ugarit grew fat on trade. Across the sea, the Mycenaean Greeks, the people of Homer's legends, the world of Agamemnon, and the Trojan War, built stone citadels and palaces of astonishing sophistication. And on the island of Cyprus, and in Babylon, and Assyria, other powers turned the wheels of commerce. These kingdoms were not isolated, they were bound together. Kings wrote letters to one another, addressing each other as brother. They exchanged lavish gifts, arranged royal marriages, negotiated treaties. Copper from Cyprus and tin from distant mountains met in the forges that made bronze, the metal that gave the age its name, the metal that made everything from farming tools to the weapons of armies. And that word, bronze, holds the first clue to the fragility beneath all this splendor. Because bronze requires two ingredients, copper and tin. Copper was common enough, but tin was rare, found only in a few distant places, and it had to travel enormous distances along trade routes to reach the workshops of the great powers. This entire civilization, its economy, its armies, its very name, depended on long, thin supply lines stretching across mountains and seas. It was a magnificent system. It was also a deeply interconnected one, and interconnection, as we will see across this channel again and again, is a source of strength, right up until the moment it becomes the mechanism of collapse. For centuries, the system held. And then, over a span of just a few decades, it fell apart. The signs appear across the historical record like wounds. In the ruins of city after city, archaeologists find the same thing: destruction layers, ash, collapsed walls, the unmistakable mark of fire and violence, dated to roughly the same terrible window of time. Ugarit, the great trading port, burned, and was never rebuilt, its final moments preserved in clay tablets found baked hard in the flames of its own destruction. One of those tablets, a letter never sent, contains a desperate plea. The city writes to an ally, "Enemy ships have been sighted. The country is undefended. Help is needed. We do not know if help ever came. We only know the city died." The Hittite Empire, one of the two great superpowers of the age, simply vanished from history. Its capital was abandoned and burned. Its royal line disappeared. An empire that had negotiated as an equal with Egypt was erased so completely that for thousands of years the world forgot it had ever existed at all. In Greece, the Mycenaean palaces were destroyed one after another. The great citadels were abandoned. And then came something historians find almost harder to comprehend than the destruction itself. The Greeks forgot how to write. The script they had used to keep their palace records fell entirely out of use. Greece descended into a dark age that would last for centuries, a silence so deep that when writing finally returned, it was in a completely different alphabet. And the memory of the old world survived only as myth and legend. Egypt alone of the great powers survived, but it survived wounded and diminished, and it would never again be the power it had been. Within a generation or two, the connected world of the Bronze Age was gone. So what happened? Who or what killed the Bronze Age world? For a long time there was a simple answer: a villain. The Egyptians left us records of a mysterious enemy they called the Sea Peoples, a coalition of raiders who came out of the water, burning and pillaging, whom the pharaohs claimed to have fought off in great battles. For decades, historians pointed to these sea peoples as the cause, the barbarians at the gate, the invaders who toppled the civilized world. But the more closely we look, the less satisfying that answer becomes. Because who were the sea peoples really? Where did they come from? The evidence suggests they were not simply an invading army from some distant land. Many of them appear to have been refugees, displaced populations themselves fleeing something. People on the move, desperate, looking for somewhere to land because their own homes had already become unlivable. Which raises a far more unsettling question. If the sea peoples were themselves running from a catastrophe, then the invasion wasn't the cause of the collapse. It was a symptom of it, a consequence of some deeper failure that was already unfolding. And here is where the story of the Bronze Age collapse teaches its central lesson, the one we will return to on this channel, empire after empire, age after age. There was no single cause. Look closely at the evidence, and what you find is not one catastrophe, but many, striking at once, feeding on each other. There is climate. Studies of ancient pollen and sediment point to a period of prolonged drought across the eastern Mediterranean, decades of failing rains, of shrinking harvests, of famine. Some of those unsent letters from dying cities speak plainly of hunger, of desperate requests for grain. There is earthquake. A series of powerful quakes appears to have struck the region in this same window, what scholars sometimes call an earthquake storm, shaking apart the very cities that were already under strain. There is the fragility we saw at the beginning, an economy built on long, thin supply lines. When drought brought famine, when populations began to move, when raiders threatened the sea lanes, those trade routes, the arteries of the whole system, were cut, and a civilization that depended on distant tin to make its bronze could not simply adapt overnight. And there is the interconnection itself. Because these kingdoms were so tightly bound together, the failure of one became the failure of all. When one region fell into chaos, its refugees flooded into the next. When one trade partner collapsed, the shock ran down the line. The very connections that had made this world rich and strong now carried the collapse from kingdom to kingdom like fire along a fuse. Drought, famine, earthquake, migration, warfare, the severing of trade. No single one of these need have been fatal, but they did not arrive one at a time. They arrived together, each one deepening the others until the whole system, too rigid to bend, too connected to contain the damage, came apart all at once. Historians have a name for this. They call it systems collapse. When a civilization becomes so complex, so interdependent, so finely balanced that it loses the ability to absorb shocks, and a cascade of failures brings the entire structure down. And that is the pattern, the shape beneath the story. It is not a lightning bolt from a clear sky. It is not usually one enemy, one battle, one villain. It is a slow accumulation of pressures, environmental, economic, political, building beneath a surface that still looks, right up until the end, prosperous and permanent. And then a cascade, a chain of failures that feed on one another until a world that seemed eternal is gone within a single lifetime. The people who lived through the Bronze Age collapse did not know they were living at the end of an age. They thought their world was solid. Their cities were old. Their kings called each other brother. Their trade routes had run for centuries. There was no reason to believe any of it could end. And then it did. This is the first descent we have on record, but it will not be the last we explore, because once you learn to see this shape, the hidden pressures, the fragile complexity, the cascade that no one saw coming, you begin to recognize it everywhere. In Rome, in the Maya cities of Central America, in empire after empire, across every continent and every century. The Bronze Age world believed it was permanent. They always do.